Well, let's go through the steps of actually determining this method of allocation, an estimated method of allocation. Step one is that management must first identify some activity which can be separately measured job by job and seems to bear some correlation with or drives or causes manufacturing overhead costs. For example, direct labor hours is a commonly used activity in the application of manufacturing overhead costs to individual jobs because it is measured job by job through time cards, and it often correlates with overhead costs. Here's what I mean. Direct labor hours, we keep track of them job by job because we require our direct employees to keep time cards or timesheets where they keep track not only of their total hours that they work, but also to designate which jobs they're working on. Remember that in job 351, our employee working on that kept track of 80 hours of hours worked, but also kept track that all 80 hours were specifically associated with job 351. All I'm saying here is that we do measure direct labor hours through time cards on a job-by-job basis. And I'm also suggesting that in many cases, not only do we measure these direct labor hours, but they do seem to have some kind of a correlating relationship with the amount of overhead costs that are incurred by a business in the manufacturing function. If we run 2 shifts of employees who are working directly on products in the manufacturing process, from 1 shift, do we have any increased overhead costs? Are we using more electricity, more utilities? Are we using more indirect materials? We probably have to run a separate shift, a second shift of supervisors. It is very likely that, that if in fact we increase the amount of hours of employees working directly on products, that we are probably also going to be increasing our manufacturing overhead costs. There probably is some correlating relationship. Now let me show you more precisely what I mean by this, or try and show this correlating relationship by this graph. This vertical axis here on the left is going to be an axis that measures the total manufacturing overhead costs on a monthly basis. Plus, it is also going to measure the amount of our direct labor hours, the number of hours that our employees working, that are actually working on in our manufacturing process per month. Now, let's look first at the total manufacturing overhead costs per month. And I've identified here that, just a measure of those costs. And I put on here that, here on this graph would be the measure of an amount of $300,000 of overhead costs, and up here, $600,000 of overhead costs. But this vertical axis also measures the direct labor hours per month. Put on here, just create in a graphic way, measures of direct labor hours, and show on here 20,000 hours of direct labor and 30,000 and 40,000. We're going to draw a line on here that shows for the last 7 months or so, and look at how much our manufacturing overhead costs. Let's assume that in the month of January last year, that we actually had $360,000 of manufacturing overhead costs. And let's also assume that in April, we had $600,000 of manufacturing overhead costs, almost double. But then back again in July, the manufacturing overhead costs are only about $300,000. So we can see this line here, which seems to show, where our overhead costs were for each of the 7 months last year, or something like that, first 7 months of the year. But we're also going to show graphically here the amount of our direct labor hours month by month, and let's assume that in the month of January we have 24,000, we had last year 24,000 hours of direct labor, and so we'll show that here graphically. And then in April we had 40,000 hours of direct labor, almost double. And then in July we only had $200,000 of direct direct labor hours. Well, you can see here graphically represented that there does seem to be some kind of a correlating relationship between our total manufacturing overhead costs month by month relative to our actual measured direct labor hours month by month. In fact, if we wanted to make a calculation of what that relationship actually is, let's figure out what that correlating relationship is by going to January and taking that $360,000 and dividing it by the 24,000 actual labor hours and say that it looks like, the costs of manufacturing overhead are running at about $15 for every hour of direct labor. And if we then move to the month of April and look at the graph, we know that in April there were $600,000 of manufacturing overhead costs, much more, but we also had more direct labor hours, 40,000 hours. But if you look at the relationship and divide 600,000 by 40,000 hours, it was about $15 an hour. See, it stays constant because the relationship, they kind of move in correlation. What I'm saying here is that for every hour of direct labor, it appears that we have additional costs of manufacturing overhead, and the additional cost is about $15 per hour. If we double our labor hours running a second shift, we're probably going to double our manufacturing overhead costs, and it runs at about $15 per hour overall. Now, what I've done here is, and again, this is that I am saying that I have identified a measurable activity, direct labor hours. We measure it job by job through the time cards of employees. I've identified a measurable activity that can be distinguished job by job through time cards that seems to bear some correlating relationship with the dollar amount of all of our manufacturing overhead costs, which include indirect materials, indirect labor, and other manufacturing overhead costs. And that relationship seems to run at about $15 an hour. And so it is totally appropriate for me to select direct labor hours as the activity upon which manufacturing overhead costs are going to be applied to jobs, because we can measure direct labor hours job by job, and we kind of know what is the average manufacturing overhead cost per hour. This graph that we looked at, where we came up with this $15 an hour, seems to be the relationship here between labor hours that are measurable and our manufacturing overhead costs in total month by month. That was historical data. That was last year. We're in a new year this year, and in fact, I wonder if that correlation is about the same. And if in fact there is, again, a correlating relationship, if in fact I'm going to apply overhead to jobs based upon the amount of measured direct labor hours on each job, 351, job order 351 versus 353 or whatever, I'm going to want to do that based upon not what last year's relationship was, but on what we think this year's relationship is. So what I'm going to do here is, in the next step, once I've identified direct labor hours as the activity that I'm going to use, I am now going to calculate an overhead rate for the future, for this next month or this next year, based upon prospective or budgeted overhead costs and budgeted or prospective direct labor hours. In fact, this is going to be the calculation. I'm going to take my budgeted, but for the time being, management gets together and the accountants and say, what do we think our overhead costs are going to be in the next month or in the next year, given the level of activity that we're going to have and these kinds of things. And they'll actually say, well, what are going to be our rent costs? What do we think our utility costs are going to be? What do we think depreciation is going to be? And we'll come up with budgets for the future. In this particular case, we're going to put in the numerator of this calculation we're coming up with the budgeted manufacturing overhead costs for the next period or month or whatever it is, in this case, month. And apparently we've come up with a number of $402,800. That's the budget for next month in terms of all of our indirect materials, indirect labor, and manufacturing overhead costs. We don't know for sure. It's our best guess of what those costs are going to be next month. The denominator in this calculation calculation of a predetermined overhead rate is our budget of direct labor hours for this next month or period, for the same period in which we made the previous budget for overhead costs. What do I mean budgeted direct labor hours? How many hours of labor do we think will take place? Are we going to, how many employees do we have? How many employees do we need to meet our expected levels of production in the next month or year period? And in this particular case, we're thinking that we're going to have about 26,500 hours of direct labor. If those are our budgeted amounts, then our budgeted correlating relationship between manufacturing overhead costs and direct labor hours runs at about $15.20 per hour. Well, last year it was $15 an hour. This year it's $15.20 an hour. So we think on a budgeted basis that our overhead costs are a little bit more relative to our direct labor hours. This is our predetermined overhead rate, which is sometimes referred to as a factory overhead rate or just kind of an overhead rate that runs at $15.20, or at least that's what we anticipate for the next period. The next step in this process of calculating the predetermined overhead rate and then using it is how we use it. Now, we've calculated the predetermined manufacturing overhead rate for furniture at about $15.20 per direct labor hour. We will then use this rate to apply overhead to each job in production based on the actual direct labor hours incurred per that job as reported in the employee's time card. How many hours of direct labor were incurred in the production of job 351, those 5 oak tables? How many hours? Well, if you went back to the job cost record, you're going to see that through time cards, we have identified and measured that we had 80 hours of direct labor hours associated with making those 5 oak tables. Well, if our overhead costs are predicted to run at about $15.20 per direct labor hour, if we simply multiply the actual measured direct labor hours of 80 hours times $15.20, then what we're really suggesting is that we think the amount of overhead costs that should be included in job 351 is an amount of $1,216. What costs are included in this $1,216? Well, they are overhead costs. In other words, we think that of the supervisor's salary, indirect labor, and indirect materials, these supplies and nails and the utility bills and depreciation, if you were to take all of those costs, we think that on a combined basis, on average, that we incur those costs on a combined basis at about $15.20 for every hour of direct labor. So of the total $1,216, which is $15.20 4 times 80 hours, that of this $1,216 are some of the sandpaper costs, some of the nails, cost of nails and glue and utilities and depreciation. And we're going to take this $1,216 of some of these costs and say those costs should be costs that are associated with making the 5 tables. We debit work in process for $1,216 and credit manufacturing overhead. See, we are now taking out of that holding account. We put all these costs, utility costs, depreciation, supervisors, we put all those costs into manufacturing overhead, and now we're saying, now we figured out how we want to apply that to work in process on a job-by-job basis. And so we credit manufacturing overhead, taking some of those costs out of there, debit work in process inventory, and when we debit work in process inventory, we must update the job cost sheet job by job. So now we'll go and since we've made this entry, we have to go to a job cost record or sheet, and we'll go to job 351. And on job 351, we have this area here for manufacturing overhead. And we're going to apply manufacturing overhead, and this is kind of a process of estimation, at about $15.20 for every direct labor hour, and we got our direct labor hours on January the 15th, X1, when we processed the time card. And so on this particular date, we're going to say we've got 80 hours of direct labor at $15.20, or $1,216 of overhead costs. Part of the utilities, depreciation, sandpaper, etc., were included as part of the cost of these 5 oak tables. And so now we know all of our costs, or at least we know our materials and labor, and we've kind of estimated how much overhead cost we think was associated with making these oak tables. The total cost, $4,316. Well, how many oak tables did we produce? Well, we made 5 oak tables. If you take the $4,316 and divide it by 5, we come up with what we think is our best guess of the cost per oak table to manufacture. It cost us a little over $863 to make one table. Now we know the material cost, we know the labor cost, it's the overhead cost that makes it, a little mushy, but we think we've got a good method of estimating how much was associated with these tables. So this is a pretty good number, we think. By the way, if I sell these oak tables to a customer at $700 a table, I mean, really, think about it. If it costs me $863 to make this and I'm selling it to a customer for $700, I'm in trouble. I've got to know what it costs me to make an oak table. I mean, we should sell this at a higher price. And so, this is critical information, and we've now determined it, at least on an estimated basis relative to the manufacturing overhead cost.